Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. Today's Supreme Court case is Gibbons v. Ogden. We're looking at some steamboat owners who did business between New York and New Jersey, and there was just kind of a lot of confusion. So Dr. Beinberg is back with us. Dr. Beinberg, does the Commerce Clause give Congress authority over interstate navigation?
Yeah, so the Gibbons v. Ogden case is effectively a question of a set of dueling licenses. We have a state license and we have a federal license to operate effectively a steamboat. And there are different holders of the licenses, and the question is sort of who gets the relevant license. And so in the Gibbons case, the Supreme Court effectively says Congress has the authority to regulate interstate commerce. That's not contested. So the question of that is, if that being so, and we think that the congressional law authorizing licenses for, again, and these are worth emphasizing, this is not a steamboat to like operate in a little pond in a state, right? These are basically in the ocean, in the rivers, right?
Yes.
That's important. That's an important detail that sometimes can get lost. And so in some sense, Gibbons is a fairly straightforward and uncontroversial case where it says, if we think that the federal government has this legitimate power, and seemingly, even under the strictest definition of interstate commerce, taking boats across oceans in multiple states is like by definition interstate commerce. So yes, the federal government can do that. And if that's the case, if there's a conflicting state law that interferes with that, then that state law has to get struck down. So Gibbons v. Ogden is not, in that sense, really that interesting or controversial. Again, it lays out the sort of the case for why the state law is invalid. And so in that case, it's kind of a quasi-sequel to McCulloch v. Maryland, like we were just talking about in our last session. Again, in some sense, the interesting wrinkle with Gibbons isn't the result that the federal government has power over interstate commerce and that includes sort of the transportation networks is, I think, fairly unobjectionable. But there are some places where Marshall uses some language that you can point at different parts of it to get very different interpretations, right? So he's going through, and he starts by creating this sort of odd, I would say it's a straw man. He says, do we want strict construction? And he says, what do gentlemen mean by strict construction? If they contend only against enlarged construction, which would extend words beyond their natural and obvious import, we should not controvert the principle, right? So if strict construction just basically means like a reasonably faithful application of the terms, then who's going to be against that? And then he says, right, but if they think that it's denying the government the powers of the grant that are sort of the most obvious interpretations of it, then that's obviously wrong, right? So he's sort of parodying strict construction there and this is part of why that term has also fallen out of favor, because so he says effectively, yeah, we want it to be the powers as fairly understood, which again is fairly unobjectionable. And then he says, okay, so what's that mean, commerce? And then he says, commerce is traffic, but it's more. It's effectively, he says intercourse. It can scarcely conceive of something that's not part of a commerce if it's navigation, that's obviously a part of it. Again, that's not that objectionable. And then he says, what does among the several states mean? And here it gets a little dicey, because he says the word among means intermingled with. A thing which is among others is intermingled with them. Commerce among the states cannot stop at the external boundary line of each state, but may be introduced into the interior. And there's a way in which that seems obvious, right? If you have a steamboat license and you're going like up the Delaware River, and then part of the river might connect into, hook off into a tributary that's going to be in a state rather than just like the Camden Philadelphia border, then again, that seems unobjectionable. Or later on, if it's a railroad line, like if you're buying a ticket, right, from Phoenix to Los Angeles, the feds probably should be able to regulate that rather than just like the 5 seconds that you're crossing over Blythe. For folks that aren't in Arizona, that's basically the border of California and Arizona, right? So yes, there's a way in which Marshall's point is kind of obvious, but there's language, saying that it's intermingled with seemingly expands it to be just something that's sort of affecting. And then probably the most controversial paragraph is where he says, the genius and character of the whole government is that its action is to be applied to external concerns of the nation and internal concerns which affect the states generally, but not those which are completely within a particular state, which do not affect other states, and which it is not necessary to interfere for the purpose of executing some powers of the general government. The completely internal commerce of a state may be considered as reserved for the state itself. So here he's recognizing like the commerce power can't just be used as a grab bag for anything that the feds want to do. But there is some language there if you're using an absolute, right, totally connected to, or it's completely within. This is why I always tell my students, don't use absolutes like that, because he's effectively saying, well, if it's not completely within a state, if there's some, then you can see where there's some wiggle room here. So again, Gibbons is the case, like McCulloch, that you can point to it in the 20th century and say, commerce means stuff that sort of affects multiple states, which I guess, and if you squint in one way, is true, but it's sort of in tension with the fairly understood kind of language in that. So Gibbons is not that interesting in what its outcome is. It is interesting because Marshall is laying out both the fairly orthodox case that the commerce power means that inconsistent state law is trumped by federal law, but there's some, we would call it dicta or something like that, which is just sort of other sort of deep thoughts, right? That section I just read is not necessary to decide the case, but Marshall often will sneak stuff in here, and he gets criticized for that really aggressively in his cases, for like saying sort of, all right, here's the actual case, but here's some additional deep thoughts with John Marshall, and that's what he's doing there.
So this kind of just establishes that if there is a fight between two states, the federal government decides that, right? Like you kind of brought up California and Arizona. I know that there's a lot of back and forth about water rights in the Colorado River. Arizona doesn't get to decide that. California doesn't get to decide that. It's going to be the federal government.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, there's not strictly a fight between the states, because it's not like we have one dueling state license and another dueling state license. It's more that the federal government, wanting to avoid that problem, passes a law. I just flagged that because there's sort of a separate track of law, which is, can the federal government, can the courts strike down state laws that are going to interfere with commerce, even if Congress hasn't acted? That's the so-called dormant commerce clause. That's not what's happening here, because Congress has explicitly passed a licensing law. So this is effectively, if Congress, trying to preempt a fight between the states, wants to say, here's effectively how we're going to do it with multi-state commerce, and then a state wants to say, well, no, we want to do this with our state. In this case, this case would come out potentially quite differently if it's, regulating, Lake, again, I'm just using an Arizona example, like Lake Pleasant or something, right? Under the Gibbons doctrine, it'd be harder for the feds to regulate that. Under modern Supreme Court doctrine, it gets a little different. But the facts are really important in this case, which is that it's about major rivers. It's not just little ponds and that aren't connected to other states. But yeah, this is effectively saying Congress can preempt state, basically commercial wars, state trade wars, if it's, again, consistent with interstate commerce. Now, what's the interstate is where Gibbons has some slippery language. But the basic parts of this case are fairly, and it's unanimous, right? There's not a dissent in this one for a reason. So I suspect some of the justices were kind of rolling their eyes at some of the language in there, but whatever. Then they have to write their own paperwork.
And that teases us perfectly because kind of later on in this, we're going to do an episode on the Commerce Clause because there is really more to the Commerce Clause than just this Supreme Court case. So, Dr. Weinberg, thank you.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.